late October 1929 and was the most devastating stock market crash in the history of the United States. When taking into account full consideration the duration of its fallout, the crash signaled the beginning of a 10-year Great Depression that affected all Western industrialized countries. The Roaring Twenties, the decade that followed World War I and led to the crash, was a time of wealth and excess. Building on post-war optimism, rural Americans emigrated to the cities in vast numbers throughout the decade with the hopes of finding a more prosperous life in the ever-growing expansion of America's industrial sector. While the American cities prospered, the vast emigration from rural areas and continued neglect of the US agriculture industry created widespread financial despair among American farmers throughout the decade and would later be blamed as one of the key factors that led to the 1929 stock market crash. The Roaring Twenties represented a period of economic boom in the history of American history. A lot of people benefited from the economic boom, however, some did not. Some industries were actually in decline during the 1920s. The old textile industries, having lack of new technique and synthetic products, meant a decline in the older industries such as cotton. The new industries did not create many new jobs. Industries grew thanks to the machinery and technology. The blacks and the immigrants, the poorest families of the African Americans, lived in the South. They were paid very low wages for long hours on plantations such as cotton and tobacco. They also suffered severe discrimination in daily life and lived in a very run-down areas of the towns and cities. It was a similar story for immigrants who often arrived in the country poorly educated and lived in the poorest parts of the city. The worst hits were the farmers who struggled during the 1920s, and almost half of all the American people were involved in farming. Tractors, combine harvesters, and other new machinery helped farmers produce more food. However, farmers ended up producing a surplus of food. As a result, food prices dropped. Despite the booming US economy of the late 1920s, Calvin Coolidge decided not to run for the president again. In his place, Republicans nominated the president's handpicked successor, popular World War I humanitarian administrator Herbert Hoover. Soon after Hoover took office, the good times and successful run of the bull market came to an abrupt halt. Stiffer competition with Britain for foreign investment spurred speculators to dump American stocks and securities in the late summer of 1929. Ever since the turn of the century, the foundation of the American economy had been shifting from heavy industry to consumer goods. In other words, whereas most of America's wealth in the late 1800s had come from producing iron, steel, coal, and oil, the economy of the early 1900s was based on the manufacturing automobiles, radios, and a myriad of other items that Americans could buy for use in their own homes. As Americans jumped in the consumer bandwagon, an increasing number of people began purchasing goods on credit, promising to pay for items later rather than upfront. When the economic bubble of the 1920s burst, debtors were unable to pay and the creditors were forced to absorb millions of dollars in bad loans. Consumer goods were not the only commodities Americans bought on credit. Buying stocks on margin had become very popular during the Roaring Twenties. In margin buying, an individual could purchase a share of a company's stock and then use the promise of that share's future earnings to buy more shares. Unfortunately, many people abuse the system to invest huge amounts of imaginary money that existed only on paper. shares at the Wall Street Stock Exchange. In the early 1920s, people were buying stocks and shares on credit terms and then selling them off quickly. Speculators even began selling off their shares at profit before paying their creditors. Soon, prices of the shares and stocks began declining, and there was no willing buyers. Companies could get no capital to run business and therefore closed, causing great unemployment. Part of the panic that caused Black Tuesday resulted from how investors played the stock market back in the 1920s. They didn't have much access to information as we have today. Stock prices weren't on the computer, they were shown via a ticker tape machine. This machine printed stock prices on a strip of paper. As stock prices dropped on Black Tuesday, panic ensued because no one knew how bad it was. The ticker tapes literally could not keep up with the pace of falling stock prices. It was pandemonium on the floor of the stock exchange, despite attempts by prominent bankers to stop the crash. The prominent bankers of today, Morgan Bank, Chase Bank, and the National City Bank of New York, intervened. The banks bought shares of stock in an attempt to restore confidence in the stock market. The bank's intervention signaled other investors to continue to sell, creating continued panic. Black Tuesday is widely regarded as the start of the Great Depression because it signaled a complete loss in confidence in the US financial system. As you can see, the cycle was vicious. Investors abandoned the stock market and started putting their money in commodities. Gold prices soared. At that time, the US was on the gold standard and promised to honor each dollar with its value in gold. As people began turning in dollars for gold, the US government began to worry it would run out of gold. The Federal Reserve thought it could come to the rescue by increasing the value of the dollar. How did it do this? By raising interest rates, which reduced liquidity to the business. Without funds to grow, businesses started laying off employees, leading to a vicious downward economic spiral, and that became the Great Depression.